Welcome to another episode of Relay Theology. I'm Justin Schieber, and with me is Ben Watkins.
Hello, everyone.
Today we're going to take a bit of a break from the interviews that we've been doing and kind of go back to kind of what we were doing in our second episode. In that episode, we talked about Roe's evidential argument from evil. And we kind of talked about all the moves in that argument, the kind of hidden premises in that argument, and the possible responses. But we didn't go into much depth on what those responses might be. And if you recall, one of the responses was called Skeptical Theism.
It's one of the leading responses.
I think it's probably fair to say that it came about as a response to Roe's argument, but it can be more broadly applied as well. So Roe's argument, if you recall, it moved from a premise about our not seeing any good reasons for some evils that occur in the world to that therefore there probably are at least some of those evils that have no good reason.
So moving from appearance to reality, it appears that it's gratuitous, so that's some reason to think that it really is gratuitous.
Obviously, the phrase skeptical theism, it comes into there are two components here. So there's the theism aspect, which it's just talking about a belief in God, and then the skeptical component is not about skepticism about the existence of God, rather it's about skepticism about our ability to make any substantive inferences about the reasons available to God. God works in mysterious ways, right? The kind of superintelligence of God is just so much greater than ours that it appears that we're just not in a place to make any real substantive claims about what kinds of things God would be likely to do or allow or what have you.
So I would even broaden that concept a little in the theism part, and not necessarily say that you have to have a belief in theism to endorse skeptical theism. Because you could say, look, it just applies to theism. Someone could be an agnostic and say, look, I don't think that we could expect to see X. And, that follows from these skeptical theist assumptions, and that's that.
Essentially, you're saying that, you don't have to be a theist to recognize some of the implications of theism.
Sure. You could be an agnostic and say, look, the evidential argument from evil is not successful because we have these skeptical considerations with epistemic limitations in relation to God.
And so to that degree, it's not exactly a great name for what we're talking about here. Because again, it doesn't require theistic belief. It just requires an interesting kind of navigation of the conceptual landscape surrounding it.
It can be rather misleading because there's obviously multiple ways that you could, interpret the phrase.
Skeptical theism is, again, a kind of undercutting defeater of Roe's argument, right? It's not saying that he's wrong in thinking that something is probably gratuitous. It's saying that he's not even allowed that inference.
Yeah.
That he gets there by, right?
It's a way to block the evidential argument from evil. It's a way to say, look, okay, yes, I accept the appearance of this evil, but we're in no good position to then infer that this appearance is really the way things are.
Right. So typically, you can kind of divide defeaters into two general different groups. You have your undercutting defeaters and your rebutting defeaters. A rebutting defeater would be an argument as a response to some claim that is a reason to think that the claim itself is actually false. But an undercutting defeater pulls out the rug, the support of that claim. And that's what skeptical theists are attempting to do to Roe's inference. They're not saying he's wrong in his conclusion. They're actually just saying that all the reasoning that he's brought to bear in support of his conclusion,
he's unjustified.
Yeah.
In the reasons that he brings.
One of the leading skeptical theists, a gentleman by the name of Michael Bergman, he has an analogy that I like to use, actually, and he talks about like a say you're a complete beginner chess player, and you're sitting down in the park. You're sitting across from an expert chess player, someone who you know is an expert, and you are also aware of yourself as a beginner. You recognize yourself as a beginner. So you look across the table, and your opponent makes a move that seems somewhat queer, somewhat strange, given your rather limited understanding of the rules and the goals of chess and the different strategies involved. You look at a move he makes and you think that's really odd.
Or that's a bad move.
It seems like it's a really bad move, right? It seems self-defeating. Now you can recognize that you have that perception, but that perception is of course rooted in your kind of superficial understanding of the game. And so it would be wrong of you at that point to infer that your expert chess player opponent actually made a bad move. Because it's far more likely that they just know more about the rules, about the strategies involved in the game, and that they're doing something that's really quite clever and is just beyond your chess pay grade, essentially.
They are aware of considerations that you're not.
Exactly. And so it would be wrong for us to, as beginner chess players, to infer that he made a wrong move. And this is kind of what's being said by the skeptical theist, that we are the novice, finite beings, right? And compared to God sitting across from the proverbial chess board, he makes a move, and from our perspective, it looks like it's a horrible suffering. It's a gratuitous suffering. It doesn't seem like it has any good reason for it. But nevertheless, we're just, for all we know, God has this intricate network of reasons of which we are utterly unaware.
And it should be pretty apparent that analogy, while it helps us understand the concepts rather well, obviously has its limits. When it comes to our observations of gratuitous evils, it happens a lot. We see it over and over and over and over and over. And so if we were going to hold that analogy constant, we would have to say that we know of this chess grandmaster, but he always seems to be making bad moves.
Yes, that's a good point.
And so now, obviously, you can respond back and forth with objections and replies to that, but you should be able to just kind of intuitively see that there's limits to what the work that this skeptical thesis can do. When you look at all the overwhelming, apparently gratuitous evils, that even in its strongest forms, skeptical theism has its limits. And I think that's actually where the term skeptical theism comes from, is from Paul Draper's paper. It's called The Limitations of Pure Skeptical Theism.
So Michael Bergman, let's talk about his version of skeptical theism. And it should be noted that while this general strategy of undercutting row-type arguments about appearances of evils, or other things that are typically foisted up against theism, that this kind of strategy is largely common to all skeptical theisms. While that's true, there are varieties of skeptical theism, and so that needs to also be kept in mind. I think we'll probably be focusing on Bergman's today, but
Dijkstra has a famous one. I guess he's kind of the guy who pioneered skeptical theism in a way.
So he has something called cornea, which is conditions
of reasonable epistemic access.
Essentially, what he's doing is he's listing these conditions under which we can make reasonable inferences, and he's saying that Rowe's argument fails to meet these conditions, essentially. Now, Bergman's thesis, he gives 4 statements which he thinks are true on theism, which essentially achieve skeptical theism and undermine Rowe's inference. But there are other versions as well. But the point is that they're
trying to block that inference. They're trying to block the crucial inference that gets you to atheism, basically.
Right, and they do it with the same kind of thoughts in mind. What they're really interested in here is the epistemic chasm that exists between mere finite human persons and the divine intellect.
I've heard the phrase epistemic distance. I mean, that's definitely a fancier word.
Well, I'm nothing if not fancy. So Bergman's skeptical thesis, as he calls it, comes in 4 parts. The first of which states that we have no good reason for thinking that the possible goods we know of are representative of the possible goods that there are. So essentially what he's talking about here is that he's not denying that we do have access to some goods. In fact, we might have access to quite a large amount of goods. But the point is that we have no good reason to think that the goods to which we do have access are representative of the total amount of goods there are, the total types of goods that there are.
A good analogy is with an iceberg, where the top of the iceberg might not necessarily be representative of the entire iceberg below the water. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We just don't know.
So yeah, the whole point here is obviously we need to be very careful about the kinds of inferences we make from what may or may not be a very limited data set to more broad claims about the nature of the iceberg.
Another
as a whole.
good visualization that I like is you would be justified if you looked around and saw no elephants in your living room to then conclude that there are no elephants in your living room. But if you were to look around your living room and say, I don't see any germs, it would not be a justified inference to then say there's no germs in my living room.
Exactly. That highlights a really important thing, because the question there is whether or not we'd expect to see them if they were there. Obviously, an elephant is a kind of thing that you would expect to see if you were in that living room and if your eyes were operating properly, right? But germs are not the kinds of things that are immediately obvious to us, and so sometimes even after looking really carefully, we still don't see the germ, right? And but it would be unreasonable for us to therefore conclude that there are no germs in that room.
Or you could even bring it up, more in scale and just say insects, things that you could, in principle, see.
Now, the second part of his thesis is kind of a mirror of the first. It just says that we have no good reason for thinking that the possible evils that we know of are representative of the possible evils that there are. So obviously this is just, all the same analogies apply, but the whole point here is that we're just talking about moral goods and evils. We're talking about the moral facts in general.
He totally could have combined those theses.
Right, yeah, I don't know why that seems needlessly complicated. Then you have 3, so it comes in 4 parts. So the third one is, we have no good reason for thinking that the entailment relationships that we know of between possible goods and the permission of possible evils are representative of the entailment relationships that there are between goods and the permissions of evils. The entailment relationship part is key here. So recall that Roe was adamant that the good that is appealed to in order to explain or to justify evil in the world, that evil needs to be logically necessary for the attainment of that good, or for the avoidance of some evil equally bad or worse.
Instrumentally necessary to attain some higher order.
Not instrumentally, though. That's the point. It needs to be logically necessary.
Okay.
That's why Roe's argument is so powerful, because it seems so difficult to come up with a logically necessary response.
Yeah.
But Bergman here is saying, look, we don't even know if the logical entailment relationships between goods and evils and permissions if the ones that we know of are representative of those that exist, right? So he's saying, Roe seems to be putting a bold challenge in front of us, but we can't even say that the logical entailments are things that we can be confident about. So the fourth statement in Bergman's thesis is that we have no good reason for thinking that the total moral value or disvalue that we perceive in certain complex states of affairs accurately reflects the total moral value or disvalue that they actually have. So this is rather intuitive, I think. Like, we can look at a certain state of affairs and think, and given our situation, perceive it in a particular way. And we might think, what a horrible thing. For example, we might be, we come across a scene where someone is putting a large blade into someone's body, and we think, well, this clearly is a bad state of affairs. There's pain going on, and someone appears to be intentionally inflicting that pain, but only if we have the background knowledge of the relevance of the lab coats that they happen to be wearing, and the fact that they're just performing a surgery. That quite obviously changes the moral nature of that situation. And so we don't always know the full details of the complex state of affairs. And that's all he's saying here, is that we just don't have any good reason for thinking that.
That's the one I find the hardest to accept. Out of all of the first three, I think are, you can concede rather intuitively, but the last one is the one that kind of raises my eyebrow.
The way in which these four theses undermine Rowe's argument, it should be coming intuitively clear at this point. When we see some horrible event in the real world taking place, and we think that's obvious, and we just perceive it as a kind of pointless evil, and an evil that is such that there's no good connected to it in a way that could possibly justify a perfect being from allowing it. And so we conclude that therefore no God exists, right? But these kind of reminders of epistemic humility here should lead us to think, to be rather skeptical of that kind of move, to be a bit shy about making that kind of Rowe inference. So one thing we might ask, after we kind of get an understanding of how skeptical theism operates in this context, one thing we might ask is, okay, are all theists skeptical theists? I mean, even if we limit theism to talking about the kind of traditional view of God, of theism as all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect God, do all persons who subscribe to that view, are they all skeptical theists? I mean, when we're talking about God's being all-knowing, and then the obvious fact that we're rather ignorant, it seems pretty intuitive that skeptical theism should be true. What do you think?
So yeah, not all theists are skeptical theists. So I think that in Rowe's argument that if you accept the premise that God would not allow any gratuitous evils, I think you are committed to the claim that there are no gratuitous evils, and that's just merely apparent. I think they are committed to that claim, but setting that aside, they're not committed.
Wait,
to...
who's committed to what claim? Sorry,
theists are not committed to the skeptical theist claim, but they are committed to this claim that there are no gratuitous evils if they accept the claim that gratuitous evils and God are incompatible.
Yes, and that is, of course, there's another debate there, but
there's another debate there. But so setting that aside, there's very prominent, well-known theistic philosophers who do not endorse skeptical theism. They think that it has implausible implications, or just kind of does too much violence to the theistic worldview just in general, and just it's an unacceptable level of skepticism.
Or they just think that it's obviously false because they think themselves as perceiving a representative portion of moral facts.
Or they think that if there was a God, we should know the facts. We should know so just like a parent tries to explain to their child why they have to get their vaccine, even though it's going to hurt, even though the child may not be able to understand all the reasons, or even really be able to appreciate those reasons and respond to them in the situation that they're in, a loving parent would still try to comfort their child in such moments. And you can kind of see how that will shade into the problem of divine silence. But then again, that's another issue. We'll leave that for another day.
One of the probably most famous Christian philosophers still living today, Richard Swinburne of Oxford, he is not a skeptical theist. He's got a number of objections to it, and we won't go into those here, but
he has several unpopular views, though.
Yeah, he does not find skeptical theism persuasive whatsoever, nor does Trent Doherty, for that matter. In fact, I have a very interesting quote here from his latest book on the problem of animal pain, which is a fascinating book, by the way, and I'm hoping to interview him soon on it. He writes, quote, "I see no clear reason to think there are kinds of goods of which we are unaware, in any relevant way. This is because we have reason to believe we have a sufficient grasp on human nature. We know what is best for humans: love, friendship, knowledge, virtue, health. And since a reason is just a grasped good, in knowing that these are the kinds of goods that would have to be realized with the appropriate relation to current suffering, we know the kinds of reasons God would have to have in mind." So here he's saying, look, we do have good reason to think that at least in general types, we do understand the reasons that would motivate God. And it's
hard to imagine general types of goods that could justify, particularly horrendous events. And so I think what Trent Doherty is trying to get at there is that, look, we might not be able to know all the particulars of it, but we would know in general.
So obviously Trent Doherty he's a Christian philosopher, so ultimately he doesn't think that evil is too big of a problem for the existence of God.
It's certainly not a decisive objection.
But he does think that he thinks he's going to go the way of theodicy and of defense rather than skeptical theism.
That's Swinburne's route too. He thinks that we should be trying to explain evils instead of trying to be skeptical and avoid certain inferences, that we should be putting forward things like free will theodicies and soul building theodicies and et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. Since the kind of skeptical theist reply has arisen in response to Rowe's paper, there have been, of course, objections that have come about, and one of those objections is by Rowe himself, one of the earlier ones. His objection essentially says something to the effect of, look, if skeptical theism is true, you have to. It commits you to this notion that even if all of human life was nothing but absolute pure terror and excruciating pain, you could never sit and consider and think about God and think, maybe there isn't a God, concluding from that data, right? Even if the world was far worse, if it was just a hellish landscape, we could still say that we don't have any reason to think that God is unlikely to have reasons connected to those horrible things in such a way as to justify them. Now, Rowe is offering this as a kind of, like a reductio. Yeah, and intuitively, I agree with him. But the theist is just gonna say, well, yeah, of course, you are not capable of making those inferences, and he'll remind us, of course, of the infinite intelligence of God and then our limited finite intelligence.
I think one of the strongest replies is to just say, look, I do think that things like bone cancer in children is gratuitous. I think that there is no good reason for that and that it is unjustifiable. So you could appeal to different moral principles here and say that it's always wrong to treat someone in a way that they could not rationally consent. Now, if that were true, well, then you have a decisive objection, because you could say, look, no one could rationally consent to having bone cancer at a young age. And so it would just be wrong to let that happen.
I don't know how I feel about that objection.
Okay. Because basically what you're saying is that, look, the appearances really are reality. The overwhelming appearance of gratuitous evil in the world just really is real.
Yeah, so I guess this is just begging the question, though, isn't it?
Well, not written. No, it's not, because you're moving from appearance to it's no more begging the question than it is to say that my appearance of the external world or the appearance of my memory experiences. I don't think it begs the question any more than those claims do.
I gotcha. So I guess it'd be good probably now to go to one of the more popular strategies. It's a general strategy.
A lot of people worry about the violence that this skeptical theses could do to their their worldview overall. What kind of implications are going to come out of this? Could we have external world skepticism, skepticism about the past, moral skepticism, divine deception? Maybe God has reasons to lie to us. These are all potential worries that a skeptical theist could have, because these are potential implications that their skepticism has.
Right, and so, again, we've already mentioned that there are different versions of skeptical theism, and so perhaps some of these won't apply to one, but may apply to another. But yeah, like as you're talking about, there's been this slew of papers that have talked about how this skepticism, in an effort to avoid Rowe's argument, has bled into other areas of life that we normally wouldn't want it to. So again, as you mentioned, could bleed into certain moral areas, right? Like if it's the case that we don't have any good reason to think that our evaluative judgments of states of affairs is representative of the actual value content of that state of affairs, what does that do to our obligations? If I'm walking in a field and I see a poor little child drowning in the water, me as an individual, I would think, well, I should probably go in and try to save that child. It would seem like a relatively easy thing to do. It's just a pond. So clearly there's an obligation that has thrust itself upon me. But if I was a skeptical theist, it's not obvious that I should save that child, because if that child is suffering, then that child's suffering is connected, so far as I know, to a great good that can only be achieved through the suffering of that child. And so what does this do to our obligations? Some have written that it obliterates much of our obligations. Others have written
our ordinary moral thinking. We wouldn't be able to make these sort of judgments. One of the things, the Peter Singer's drowning child thought experiment, one of the things why that's, one of the crucial parts of that argument, why it has force, is because we so easily accept that, yes, we have this moral obligation to help this child. Well, skeptical theism seems to say, whoa, maybe you shouldn't accept that obligation so easy. Maybe you are exercising your free will and frustrating God's divine plans.
Right. So you're in a kind of moral paralysis situation. You just don't know.
I think that's a good term.
What the right thing to do here is. And so again, others have written that the skeptical theism has pretty poor implications on our knowledge of content about God that has scripture justification only. So this is some of the work of Eric Wielenberg has argued this, wherein he says that any statement, and these are primarily theological statements that have biblical justification only,
or Word of God justification.
Word of God justification only is a better way to put it. That these kind of statements, we have no good reason to think that those are not lies. We, for example, can't. If we're not in a position to assess the probability of God, allowing a fawn to die in the forest, then we're not in a position to assess the probability of whether or not God has reasons to lie to us, in some biblical text or in some special revelation or what have you.
And if you try to appeal to God's goodness by saying God wouldn't lie to me because God is all good, well, it's the same move on the other side, where you just say, well, we're appealing to God's goodness and saying that he wouldn't allow all this suffering.
Well, notice then that this person would be betraying their skeptical theism, because now they're saying that they do know the entailment, the behavior entailment of certain moral properties. That's not available to at least a Bergman skeptical theist.